Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Public Podcast. I'm your host, Kinsey Grant, and today's show is brought to you by Gambling.com Group, ticker GAMB. Today, I have a wonderful guest, Max Bischel. He's going to join us to talk about the global online gambling industry. He is the United States VP at Gambling.com Group, which is a performance marketing company for that online gambling industry. And we have a ton of interesting stuff to cover. There's been some very impactful news in this gambling ecosystem over the last couple of weeks. So we're going to get to that. We're going to talk about some of the big forces at play in this sector and hopefully learn a ton. So Max, thank you so much for joining. Welcome to the Public Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. We're excited to hear a little bit more today. And like I mentioned, we're having this conversation in light of some pretty big news out of Kentucky last week, home to the Kentucky Derby, some very big time college sports, UK Wildcats. The state just legalized online sports betting. Kentucky has legalized online sports betting. So tell me a little bit about the impact of this decision in Kentucky and maybe some background on this decision to legalize online sports betting and launch into online betting. Tell me a little bit about kind of the context of this move.
Sure. So how politics and legislation works in the United States varies from state to state, but there are some common themes of how things actually get done. So a bill is proposed, goes through the House, goes through the Senate, gets signed by the governor, and at some point that legislation needs to be acted upon by a regulatory body and rules and regulations are made. And then you get to the point where we're at last Thursday at about 6 a.m. You were finally able to place a legal online sports bet in the state of Kentucky. So I said that very quickly, but it takes months and sometimes years to get a bill properly worded to where everyone gets what they need. Both parties agree, both the House and the Senate agree, and then the governor ultimately agrees. And that takes time. So there are significant labor pains to get some of these legislation efforts and regulatory efforts up and running, all in an effort just to get to that one day where finally residents can safely gamble on sports in a state in the U.S. And in this case, it's Kentucky, who's surrounded by other states that have already enacted sports betting laws and rules and regulations to allow them to offer their citizens and folks in the state to gamble responsibly on sports. So it's a great opportunity for Kentucky to reach parity with their other neighbors and bordering states. So the tax revenue that's driven from these efforts and these activities is not leaving the state anymore. It's staying within the confines of the state, which ultimately is good for, well, one, lawmakers because they can protect consumers, but also the greater good of the public, where they take that revenue and apply it to education or water programs or infrastructure, or wherever the legislation mandates where the revenue goes, can help everyone. And it's something that many states, over 24 states, have adopted online sports betting legally. And Kentucky is now the most new one for the industry to allow for online sports betting.
Yeah. And you mentioned the 24 states that have already legalized online sports betting. I'm in New York. This was a huge story a couple of years back, online sports betting becoming legal. And I would love to hear your perspective on the sort of broad strokes state of play right now for legal sports betting in the U.S. We've talked at certain times over the last couple of years about the potential for a federal legalization, the unlikelihood of something like that happening. But tell me a little bit about kind of where the momentum is heading. What are the trends that are at play right now in the U.S. as we consider online sports betting in a legal way? Kind of what's going on? What are your expectations for other states that might follow suit, like Kentucky?
Sure. So there's a bunch of really great case studies of states that have adopted, safely regulated, and launched and contributing meaningfully to state budgets. And you look at the balance sheet of many states, it's surprising more and more have not taken up online sports betting in an effort to generate some revenue to at least balance some sort of budget in their given state. And so over the past 5 years, since the Supreme Court has repealed PASPA, banning sports betting on professional and amateur sports, you now have the floodgates open where states can make the decision themselves if they want to regulate sports betting, whether it's through legislation or a referendum or however the state of note is able to pass legislation and regulation. So so far things have gone exceptionally well. You had some inertia and some momentum to where states continually pick up and they realize that it's not as daunting of a task as they may have thought previously. And the stigma and the taboo nature of sports betting, I believe, has subsided over the past several years, given mass media. You have very famous celebrities, athletes supporting sports betting, and it is safe. You're talking about brand names like DraftKings and Caesars and MGM that people are very familiar with, and soon to be ESPN Bet, where people are all familiar. Whether or not you get on sports or not, you're aware of ESPN. You're probably aware of DraftKings because you've seen commercials all across the nation on very big events. So the tailwinds in the industry are significant, especially when you look at the population of how many folks have access to regulated safe sports betting versus the ones that don't. And we're getting close to kind of 50%. We're over 50% of states where you have some sort of sports betting available. Where in the future, hopefully, we get to when you talk about states like Texas, California, and Florida, that's really where you start to tip the scales, right? New York is the one of the larger cornerstones of online sports betting, given the breadth of competition in the state and the amount of people in the states. But the tax rate is something that it all goes into a cocktail, and some of them taste better than others. And New York is not ideal, but a state like Kentucky, very reasonable tax rate of 14.25%, with a competitive market where there could be 27 operators where you could wager responsibly with, in comparison to two, three, or four, and a licensing process that is conducive to competition and being very amenable to business interests, where they're able to get off the ground. They may make a couple mistakes unintentionally, but they can fix those and keep hit the ground running. So that's one of the tailwinds in the industry. And then you talk about online casino that's only available in about 4 states right now. That's really where you start to get into broad adoption, where the demographics are not split. It's applicable to the entire population versus a subset of 18 to 45 males. You get into a different demographic. So those are some of the tailwinds that we're facing, or that we're taking advantage of. And then some of the headwinds that we're facing are on the regulatory and legislative front, where this issue becomes a bipartisan issue, and it's very much a tit for tat on what, hey, I give you online gambling, what do you give me? And each state is different given the complexion of the legislature, the governor, and what their interests are, is where we're at right now. So that's the headwind that we're facing.
You mentioned that it's almost surprising that, given those tailwinds, that more states haven't at least engaged in serious conversations about legalization. Is it mostly those headwinds that are keeping states from doing that, or what might be the incentive not to legalize online sports betting right now?
I think some of the incentive is around a principle of sports betting is bad. It's potentially addictive. There are some issues with gaming, and some states, most states in the U.S., for context, have some sort of land-based gaming where you can walk into a casino, pull a slot machine, throw a couple bucks down on a blackjack table, spin the roulette wheel. You can do that in most states. Over 40 states, you can. There's a retail casino you can walk into. There's some other states where that doesn't exist. So the citizens and policymakers and lawmakers are not familiar with gaming, and they don't understand the instruments in place to help prevent the concerns of those other states, whether it be responsible gambling, protecting consumers, anti-money laundering. There's a long list of things people associate with gambling that they believe are nefarious or not great for children, or to be, I mean, this is not for kids. This is a very much a needing to be of age, and there's plenty of structures in place to make sure the right people are accessing this form of entertainment. So those are really the headwinds, and it's something that increasingly it's a fear of missing out is how I like to think about it. Because you take Kentucky, for example, which we just discussed, I'm hard pressed to believe that they were not involved or inspired by the other states around them that legalized sports betting, got tremendous headlines about revenue. A lot of their policymakers were lauded as pioneers in the space and a way to help citizens and to let tax revenue stay within the state. And I think that's really is a powerful message for legislatures, especially in an election year. So you take an election year, plus the election year is tough because it can go either way, obviously. And that's really where, if they want to roll the dice, no pun intended, they have to really be sure that it's going to be successful and needed to be for the betterment of their commonwealth or state.
Right. Yeah. Want to play the right side of that domino effect.
Yeah.
You mentioned that this kind of boils down in some capacities to narrative. A lot of the stories that are being told around online gambling and sports betting rely a lot on narratives that, as we both know, can sometimes be true and can oftentimes be false. So I'm curious what the perspective is for gambling.com Group specifically as an operator within the space, as a news purveyor. Tell me a little bit more about how you interpret that narrative and maybe how that narrative has fallen short at some points.
Yeah, I think it's a full understanding of what's going on. So at gambling.com, we are a purveyor of news. We're straight facts of this is happening. You take some of the unfortunate events that MGM and Caesars are going through with some cyber attacks. We're reporting the facts. This is what happened. This is what they're planning to, and what we suspect will happen. And outside of that, we're also supporting the industry because our main mode of communication with end consumers is through Google searches. And that's where the majority of the population goes to learn about almost anything. And so if you are looking for the best sports books in your state, or you're looking for the NFL MVP Super Bowl odds of Patrick Mahomes versus when will Aaron Rodgers come back, or will the Giants ever win another game? All of those are something that we help people, one, get information, learn about something that they're interested in. And then if they do show intent to want to wager responsibly, we can help them find the best sports book for them, whether it's the types of sports they can wager on, or the deposit methods that are available, or different promotions that are available, whether it's specific to the New York Jets in New Jersey or it's the Steelers in Pennsylvania. There's a bunch of different ways for us to connect with consumers. And because of that, we can help support responsible gambling as well to make sure that they're not wagering with illicit or illegal offshore sports books. Mm-hmm. So by dominating those search results, when someone searched for best sports book in New York, you're going to get MGM, DraftKings, FanDuel, Caesars, those top names, versus a betonline.ag where they look very similar, but the instruments by which they're employing sports betting is very, very different.
Yeah, and we're verging into a convenient segue here to talk a little bit about some of the biggest business entities in this space. But before we do that, out of just sheer personal curiosity, does anybody place bets on like pop culture aspects of sports? Maybe one Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift relationship that's gotten a lot of attention lately.
I was reading an article this morning about viewership this past weekend, and it's not small, the impact that she has had on sports and just viewership, right? Yeah. If I were a network executive, I'd be very happy of all the primetime games the Chiefs have, and I would not be surprised in the least if more Chiefs games were not moved to primetime later in the year, exclusive of the fact that the Chiefs are winning games and are perennially a very strong team in the AFC. But you couple those two together and the Chiefs become a very hot commodity. Yeah. Not only do they win, you see one of the most famous people on earth right now at the game cheering. It's something that I think the U.S. really enjoys. So it's very good for the industry because you also will get people to see ads for some things that they may have not been exposed to. And some of the commentary and analysis on those networks involves gambling. So when someone is talking about, hey, Travis Kelce's with Taylor Swift, they're also talking about how many touchdowns Patrick Mahomes may throw or how many defensive touchdowns they may score. So worlds are colliding right now. And I think it's definitely not a negative for the online gambling industry. If anything, we're starting to streamline, hopefully into mainstream.
Yeah. Swiftonomics, bringing us all together. So yeah, this is the follow-up to all of this, of course, is understanding some of the business entities that are driving the future of sports betting and online gambling. So tell me a little bit about, as legalization becomes more common in more states, and hopefully this domino effect does continue to move in the direction that you and the rest of the company likely want it to move. Tell me a little bit about some of the biggest factors at play, some of the biggest businesses in this industry, kind of who you pay attention to understand where we might go next, what trends might be impacting online sports betting next.
Sure. I think the biggest thing for us is evangelizing the concept of sports betting and the ecosystem that exists already. And that's the tough part for some people to conceptualize that if you're in Texas right now, there's no legislation permitting online gambling, but you can 1000% go online, put dollars or Bitcoin or something into an account and wager on sports. That is totally unregulated. Some of it may be safe, some of it maybe not, but my hope is that people are not finding out that it's not safe and they're getting taken advantage of. But that does exist. That does happen. It's the nature of the internet. It's very hard to police the internet to just have good actors. We are a country based on freedom of speech. So if someone wants to publish something on the internet, they are able to do that. And for gambling.com specifically, our message is, along with the operators, we're all on the same page and pushing the snowball forward to try to gain some larger mass, is that this thing is already occurring. Let us do our thing, which is regulating it, shepherding people into the correct ways where they're safe and protected, and there's measures in place to actually do that. And that's our message: is, hey, there's something coming. It's already happening. You're losing money. Let's flip that script so you can generate revenue and protect your consumers and help your balance sheet and give people a form of entertainment that they clearly want in 25 other states. There is demand there. And I think that's really one of our mandates as an industry, is to how do we push the thing forward? And it really is based on a collaborative effort to promote responsible gambling, safe and secure regulation, and legislation that's sensible, mostly around tax rates, so that when the industry does open, it is viable and it is something that we can generate revenue and value for both the entire ecosystem of the value chain, whether it's excuse me, shareholders, regulators, whomever.
All right. Well, I think that makes a ton of sense, and it's an interesting kind of final point here to talk about when we consider, the ways that this industry is collaborative, is intersectional in a lot of interesting ways with other major forces that can certainly impact the way that we as investors interpret how we want to spend our money. So thank you so much, Max, for joining me today. This was a wonderful conversation. I learned a ton.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you once again to our guest, Max Bischel from gambling.com Group, for joining us today. And thank you to all of you for listening. We will be back soon with even more updates from the sports economy and beyond.